Imagine, if you will, a hardcore AEW fan, and I mean one of the real die-hard AEW fans, sitting down one night to watch Dynamite. He or she went on Twitter earlier in the evening to rip into the competition and talk about how WWE just doesn't promote the kind of wrestling that they enjoy. They have their AEW merchandise on, they have logged into their AEW group chat getting ready to talk about tonight's Dynamite matches. They turn the channel to TNT and there's Vince McMahon on their TV screen saying that the WWE are taking over the time slot. There's no Chris Jericho tonight, there's no Kenny Omega, there's no CM Punk, no Young Bucks. Instead, this hardcore AEW fan is going to get presented with match recaps from WWE Raw and WWE Smackdown throughout the show. Could you imagine the backlash if something like this happened? Well, something very similar happened back in 1984, although thankfully social media wasn't a thing back then. Vince McMahon appeared on Georgia Championship Wrestling back in July of 1984, a show that aired on WTBS. It was completely out of the blue and completely unexpected. Fans were expecting to sit down and watch the likes of Tommy Rich, the Road Warriors, Jake Roberts and Jimmy Valiant, but instead they were treated to match recaps that featured the likes of Big John Studd, the Iron Sheik, Bobo Brazil and Jesse Ventura. The July 14th episode of World Championship Wrestling on WTBS became known as Black Saturday, and this is the topic of our video today. First, we should look at Georgia Championship Wrestling and clear up any confusion regarding their Saturday night TV show. Once we understand the show and Ted Turner's involvement, then the rest becomes a lot easier to grasp. Georgia Championship Wrestling was found all the way back in 1944, then known as ABC Booking. In the 70s, the company made its television debut on ABC affiliated channels with Big Time Wrestling airing on Saturday afternoons, but the promotion would later move its programming to an independent station named WTCG, a station that was owned by Ted Turner. Pro wrestling was good for independent stations like this because it was so cheap to produce, and also wrestling shows garnered a lot of views. Soon enough, WTG became known as WTBS, a satellite distributed Superstation, and Georgia Championship Wrestling would remain a part of the Superstation's programming. Many wonder why Ted Turner remained so loyal to WCW during difficult times in the 90s, and well, this is your answer. Turner loved pro wrestling and it was a cornerstone of his programming even when he was running independent channels without any kind of network. There's a certain loyalty he had to pro wrestling, and wrestling shows were always solid performers on his channels. Georgia Championship Wrestling would thusly become the first National Wrestling Alliance territory to get featured on cable television, meaning the promotion was available nationwide to those who had the luxury of satellite or cable television. In 1982, Georgia Championship Wrestling changed the name of its weekly Saturday show to World Championship Wrestling. It's been said that Ted Turner requested the name change to get away from the show's regional-sounding predecessor, and this name change is something that seems to cause confusion about Black Saturday. While Ted Turner would eventually own a company named World Championship Wrestling, or WCW, the show that Vince McMahon appeared on was the Georgia Championship Wrestling show that was named World Championship Wrestling, so no, Vince McMahon did not appear on the WCW promotion during Black Saturday. The name change sparked rumours that Jim Barnett, one of the company's owners, was trying to expand Georgia Championship Wrestling into a national organisation, not unlike what Vince McMahon was doing with the World Wrestling Federation. In September of 1983, Vince McMahon brought WWF All-American Wrestling to cable television after purchasing a Sunday morning time slot on the USA Network that was previously held by Southwest Championship Wrestling. McMahon would also debut the WWF talk show Tuesday Night Titans in May of 1984 on the USA Network, and this means that Vince McMahon had two separate shows on the USA Network while also maintaining syndicated wrestling programs such as All-Star Wrestling and WWF Championship Wrestling. Wanting to dominate the cable distribution of pro wrestling and pretty much control all wrestling that aired on cable television, with two networks airing WWF shows, Vince McMahon approached Ted Turner in hopes of purchasing the Georgia Championship Wrestling time slot where the World Championship Wrestling show would air, and Ted Turner refused to sell. Vince McMahon would have to find another way to get his programming on WTBS. Running the show backstage at GCW was a mixture of company owners and bookers. You had Jack and Jerry Briscoe holding stakes in the organisation, Jim Barnett held stock, and you also had Ole Anderson and Paul Jones owning a piece of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Ole Anderson has been singled out as one of the main culprits responsible for backstage turmoil at Georgia Championship Wrestling. The company owners apparently didn't like how he booked shows, they didn't like his general attitude, and they didn't like how he operated the business. McMahon knew there were backstage issues, and Vince McMahon came up with a way to please these company owners. If Vince McMahon couldn't buy the Saturday night Turner time slot, then he was going to try and actually buy the company that occupied Saturday nights on WTBS. The Briscoes, Barnett and Jones would all be involved in the sale, while Ole Anderson would not be involved. Vince McMahon said, "I thought it was a brilliant manoeuvre on our part, quite frankly. If I could attack the cable audience from both ends, from a USA Network standpoint and also from a Turner Network standpoint, with Turner as a Superstation being in more cable systems in the USA, I thought that would be a great 1-2 punch into the cable market and thus into pay-per-view." The Briscoes were doing some work with Jim Crockett around the time when Vince McMahon reached out to make an offer. Gerald Briscoe said, "At the time, Vince was cherry-picking the top wrestlers around the United States, and he asked Jack if he was able to talk. Jimmy Crockett was right there, and Jack said, 'No, I'm not.' Vince said, 'Well, give me a call when you guys are at a place where you can talk.' Later, we went to Jack's apartment. Vince called again, and originally we were just talking about coming to work for him. During the conversation, Jack made the suggestion that we were looking to sell Georgia Championship Wrestling. Vince flew us up to LaGuardia on a day off later that week, and we met in a conference room. Nobody ever knew about it. We sat down and talked about working for him and also about selling Georgia Championship Wrestling. I told him that we could get the controlling interest to vote in our favour because some of the stockholders were really disgruntled about the direction of the company. No one was really making any money, even though we were doing great business." The fact that no one was making any money out of GCW is quite important. Jerry Briscoe would say that Ole Anderson wasn't forthcoming in regards to the revenue being generated by the company, and the Briscoes felt that Anderson was actually taking money away from them. Ole Anderson was rubbing the other owners the wrong way, both in terms of finances and how he was running the company, and it seems like Vince McMahon knew this all too well, and he used this to gain Georgia Championship Wrestling. Jerry would continue on. "We had a very dysfunctional company. The company was making real good money at events, and we'd started running in Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Pennsylvania. But we weren't getting any good dividend checks. We agreed to a deal where Ole would pay us a little bit of money on the side. He continued the payments for about 3 or 4 months, then he dropped them because he said business was so bad. But it wasn't. We were aware that business was really good in those markets we were running. Ole was not going to change his income, but he wanted to take money away from us." The Briscoes didn't hold enough stock to outright sell the company to Vince McMahon. They only held minority interests. But including Paul Jones in the deal pushed them over the 50% range. Paul too was losing money on GCW, and maybe he saw the writing on the wall when the Briscoes wanted to sell, but whatever the case, Paul gave the Briscoes proxy voting of his shares, meaning Georgia Championship Wrestling could get sold to Vince McMahon. Researching Jim Barnett and all this gives conflicting information. Some say Vince McMahon totally worked Barnett and the Briscoes by doing 2 separate deals at the same time. Others say that Barnett had already sold so much of his Georgia Championship Wrestling stock to the other owners that he wouldn't have made a dent in the deal anyway. But whatever the case, Jim Barnett was done with Georgia Championship Wrestling and he soon ended up working for Titan Sports. Ole Anderson became aware of a potential sale when the Briscoes shopped around for other potential buyers. Jerry said they approached Jim Crockett about buying their shares, but apparently Anderson put a stop to that by telling Crockett that the shares were overpriced. So it seems like Ole Anderson was in the middle here trying to block any kind of sale, but really, it didn't matter in the end. About 6 months after the Briscoes met with Vince McMahon, the sale went through. Vince McMahon was now the majority owner of Georgia Championship Wrestling, and therefore, Ted Turner had no choice but to put a Vince McMahon show on his Saturday night time slot. Vince had completely forced Ted Turner's hand in order to get on WTBS on Saturday nights. Along with the money that traded hands, the Briscoes and Jim Barnett ended up with WWF jobs. Paul Jones got what he could financially out of Vince McMahon, and Ole Anderson was left with, well, not a lot. Through this wholesale, Ole Anderson was left out in the cold, and he would go on to hold a lot of resentment for Vince McMahon. He and legendary announcer Gordon Solie apparently quit working for the company out of protest after the Vince McMahon acquisition, though it's still debated whether or not Solie was actually fired like many others who worked under the GCW banner. It's also been rumoured that Ole Anderson destroyed many of the original Georgia Championship Wrestling tapes in protest of the purchase, though this hasn't been confirmed. And Ric Flair wrote in his book that Ole tried to pay the Road Warriors to break Jerry and Jack Briscoe's legs in a tag team match as a way of getting revenge. That's how serious this was. What you need to really take in here is the fact that the 6:05 Saturday slot was not only the Georgia Championship Wrestling slot, but it was the big NWA slot that ensured the National Wrestling Alliance was visible to fans who benefited from cable television. Syndication and regional shows are one thing, but being on cable on the Superstation was important to the NWA's growth and exposure. Sure, the organisation would still exist, but it wouldn't have nearly the same amount of nationwide distribution. It would be like SmackDown today, only being available in certain parts of the country and limited to a few select markets, with no opportunities to grow. It wouldn't be feasible, never mind being lucrative. The WWF being on TBS is a fascinating thing to look back on for sure, and many would highlight Black Saturday as being this cool moment where McMahon, quote, invaded another television show, but the reality is, this move had the potential to completely alter the course of pro wrestling, and in actuality, when all was said and done, it did. In the end though, Ted Turner realised it wasn't going well and he wanted out of the deal, a deal that McMahon said was based on a handshake and nothing more. A few very slick moves from Turner would see McMahon leave the time slot he so desperately wanted, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Fans settle in to watch GCW's World Championship Wrestling show on July 14th, 1984, and out of the blue, here's Vince McMahon, seen by many NWA diehards as the enemy of traditional pro wrestling. Vince says it's a pleasure to be associated with WTBS, and he promises to bring the best professional wrestling in the world to viewers at home. After running down tonight's WWF matches that will get featured on World Championship Wrestling, a bunch of upcoming live events get promoted, all of which are WWF events. Adrian Adonis and Dick Murdoch vs Special Delivery Jones and Nick DiCarlo is then shown, a WWF taped match. So just imagine fans who sat down to watch the typical studio wrestling that GCW's World Championship Wrestling previously offered, but they instead got these taped matches from multiple venues. WWF style promos also aired during the show. There was an advertisement for the WWF magazine, and the show featured even more taped WWF matches, ending with Big John Studd vs Bobo Brazil. Freddie Miller, the only on-air original from the old World Championship Wrestling show, closed the broadcast with Vince McMahon saying that we saw some great action today, and he puts over the wrestlers and promos we just saw. He says he looks forward to seeing more superstars of the World Wrestling Federation. The show ends, and then the complaints came in. Almost immediately, fans were in a complete uproar. This wasn't the wrestling they wanted to see. The WWF had a reputation for being a much more kid-friendly and cartoony wrestling organisation, even as early as 1984, and fans who wanted the more gritty style of NWA wrestling were annoyed that one of their favourite shows just got the Vince McMahon treatment. Letters were written to Ted Turner from fans explaining that this isn't what they tune into WTBS to see, and over time, the ratings also took a hit. The WWF seemed content with filling World Championship Wrestling with repeat matches that were available on the USA Network, or squash matches, and this was something fans who were familiar with Georgia Championship Wrestling didn't care to see. To be fair, squash matches did air on TBS before Vince McMahon came along, but the frequency of throwaway bouts featured on the WWF World Championship Wrestling show was quite ridiculous when compared to the original. The NWA version of the show was much more popular, it attracted more viewers, and the TV ratings proved this. Ted Turner got annoyed for a few reasons. First, the fan letters were piling up asking for a return to the glory days of the show. Thousands of letters apparently reached Turner asking for Vince McMahon to get removed, and also fans wanted the return of Gordon Solie. Secondly, the ratings had dropped significantly. I don't think I need to explain that. Thirdly, Vince McMahon had promised live matches that would take place in TBS studios, and this didn't happen, instead airing matches that appeared on WWF Championship Wrestling and WWF All-Star Wrestling. It wasn't until March of 1985 where McMahon would put on studio matches after Turner threatened to pull the plug and after the program was renamed to WWF Georgia Championship Wrestling, although to be fair, these were still squash matches. To combat all this, Turner made some drastic decisions. If he couldn't kick the WWF off his own network due to a quote handshake agreement, then he was going to simply bring back the wrestling his core audience loved in different time slots. Turner approached Bill Watts and an offer was made to bring Mid-South Wrestling to TBS, taking a Sunday afternoon slot, and Ole Anderson began promoting Championship Wrestling from Georgia, and that promotion got affiliated with the NWA, so Turner decided to give Anderson a time slot also on Saturday mornings. Championship Wrestling from Georgia was seen as the true successor of the original GCW. The show even brought back Gordon Solie. Both Mid-South and Championship Wrestling from Georgia did better ratings than WWF World Championship Wrestling, and Vince McMahon wasn't happy with how things were turning out. McMahon thought he would completely control wrestling on cable television, but he didn't consider for a moment that Turner would simply add more shows to his network. And with the WWF losing viewership and being seen as even more cartoony in comparison to these other wrestling shows on TBS, McMahon decided to give in. All this time, all this fighting, all the deals that had to be made. You could say that Vince McMahon was played at his own game here, but the problem was, Vince was trying to outsmart a network owner, and even right up to the present day, the network is something that Vince McMahon answers to. It's not the other way around. You can't overlook how sweet this must have been for Ole Anderson too, by the way. Not only was he giving the middle finger to Vince McMahon after being left out in the cold, but he was also back to promoting a wrestling show on cable television that more fans wanted to see. So Vince McMahon was now losing viewers, and this meant he was also losing money. Jim Crockett Jr., owner of Charlotte, North Carolina-based Jim Crockett Promotions and NWA president, would end up making a deal with Vince McMahon, a deal that would have huge implications when we consider the evolution of pro wrestling on TV. For $1 million, Vince McMahon would sell the time slot to Crockett. Jim Crockett Promotions, who had similar aspirations to the WWF in terms of going national, had also just purchased Championship Wrestling from Georgia, so this purchase would lead to JCP becoming the dominating wrestling organisation on Turner Networks, while also putting the National Wrestling Alliance back at the forefront on TBS. Fans rejoiced as Vince McMahon's wrestlers were taken off the channel and replaced with proper studio wrestling once again. Vince McMahon counted his losses and he moved away from Turner Networks, although his plans for expansion were far from over. McMahon had a big ace up his sleeve, and this sale would help in funding an event that would become the Super Bowl of wrestling, an event that mixed the world of celebrity, music, pop culture, and of course pro wrestling, and that event was named WrestleMania. WWF World Championship Wrestling's final show featured a ton of hype for WrestleMania 1, and the final Saturday night WWF show on TBS aired on March 30th, the night before WrestleMania in Madison Square Garden. Crockett took over the following week, so it could be said in a roundabout way that JCP paid for WrestleMania. If we jump ahead a bit, when JCP was struggling financially in the late 80s, Ted Turner didn't want to lose pro wrestling on his network, and the steady ratings Jim Crockett Promotions brought in with their version of the World Championship Wrestling show. And so Ted Turner himself would purchase Jim Crockett Promotions, and Turner's new wrestling organisation would get renamed to World Championship Wrestling, the same name as the TBS show that had been operated under so many other promoters such as Ole Anderson, Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett Jr. As for Vince, well, he didn't do too badly in the end. The sale of the time slot helped to further fund WrestleMania, and also McMahon ended up with another time slot on the USA Network. This one was made available for the WWF Primetime Wrestling show. Vince would just have to live with another wrestling company being available to homes with cable television, and having these two companies on separate networks would end up leading to very big things. It was actually a good thing for wrestling viewers at home. The story continued on with the WCW promotion becoming Vince McMahon's biggest ever rival, and in around 7 or 8 years' time after Turner purchased the company, WCW would become a real headache for the WWF when WCW Nitro went head to head with WWF Raw on Monday nights. The rather legendary Saturday night time slot would host WCW Saturday Night from 1992 onwards, and by the time Nitro came around, the Saturday night show would get relegated to B-show status. Still, had Vince McMahon not made that Saturday night time slot purchase on TBS, and had the events afterwards not taken place, who knows where we would be today in terms of pro wrestling on television. Although it all ended up as a failure on the WWF's part, Black Saturday in many ways was the origins of the Turner vs McMahon rivalry and the catalyst for the Monday Night War. If McMahon had stayed on TBS and if the WWF produced a show that people wanted to see on Saturday nights, well, you best bet that wrestling in the 90s would have been way different, and the domino effect would bring us to modern wrestling also looking very different. It's all very intriguing, and it leaves us with a lot of what-if scenarios, but what it also shows us is that really anything is possible in the world of wrestling when money is involved. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one, and take care.